Happy Sunday, everybody. Today we're talking about super duper political neutrality. Really, this is a response to or some musings about an announcement that was made just 3 days ago with, from what I saw, very little fanfare. There was a Salt Lake Tribune article about it. There was a Deseret News article about it, but I didn't really see it kick up much conversation, much interest, and the reports I saw talk about it didn't really get into it very much at all. And that is, the church released an update to their statement on political neutrality. For those of you who aren't of my faith, I'm referring to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They have long had a statement on political neutrality. They've modified it over time, but they made a lot of modifications 3 days ago. June 1st, they announced and published the new statement. So what I want to do today is to point out some of the distinct differences between the old letter and the new letter, and then muse on why they might have rewritten this or included or excluded these things. So I haven't seen anyone at all in the past few days do this type of comparative analysis to show what the old statement on political neutrality said and what the new one says. This matters, of course, because, as I've mentioned in past musings, from direct knowledge and experience, the church does engage on certain political issues, sometimes transparently and publicly, sometimes quietly and behind closed doors. And so the church has been involved politically. Of course, the church has to deal with political things. And, we saw most recently the fine by the SEC for, filing things wrong. And so there's lots of political implications around church activity, even just missionary work and being able to hold church services during COVID. Like, politics touches everything, right? So the church has had these statements to, in the past, give them a little bit of breathing room to say, well, no, we're not going to engage in those things. We are going to engage in those things. We're politically neutral. We get along with Republicans and Democrats or political parties in every country. They've also said, of course, in the past and in other statements that principles compatible with the gospel may be found in different political parties, which is always funny because the modern kind of Democrats, who are often a minority in the Mormon church, will often say, oh, that means that principles compatible with the gospel are also found in the Democrat Party. I'm like, nah, that's not what the statement says. It says principles compatible with the gospel may be found. It does not say that they are found in multiple different parties. It just says they may or may not be. Now, last year in February, I did a musing on the Russia-Ukraine war. And at that time, the church put out some kind of statement talking about their, desire of peace, and that, hey, we have church members on both sides of the conflict. And it was this statement that was just pro-peace. And that's good. That's good to see. But what I talked about in that musing, this was February of 2022, what I talked about was that the scriptures require us not just to proclaim peace, but also to renounce war. And so I felt at that time that the statement did not go far enough, that to be consistent with the scripture, perhaps it should have included renunciations of this warfare and, tell these people to knock it off, and that we, don't support this warfare at all. It certainly doesn't follow God's law of war, which we see in Doctrine and Covenants 98. So I talked about that in that musing as well, what the scriptures actually say is justified warfare. So you can go back and check that one out if you'd like. I mentioned that from over a year ago, almost a year and a half, because it feels like to me, as I read this new political statement, this new statement on political neutrality, better put, I feel like the whole Russia-Ukraine thing is almost like a backdrop for a lot of the new things that are included in this revised letter. You'll see what I mean as we get into it. As I share a couple of these particular examples, I'll reference this Russia-Ukraine thing and remind you. So let's start. The previous statement had an introductory paragraph, and the new statement has a paragraph that is about twice as long. So in the previous statement by the church on political neutrality, they said that the church's mission is to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ, not to elect politicians. I like that line. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is neutral in matters of party politics. This applies in all of the many nations in which it's established. All right, so that's the introductory paragraph. What is interesting to me is there's one word there that was omitted in the new update, where before the statement said that the church is neutral in matters of party politics. Now it says, let me find this part, it says the church is neutral in matters of politics within or between the world's many nations, lands, and people. So it removed the word party. Before it was saying we're neutral in party politics, not necessarily neutral in politics itself. But now the statement omits the party reference, and here's additional things it says. So the work of the new statement here I'm reading from. The work of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints includes sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ, strengthening individuals and families, and caring for those in need. This is all new language. The church does not seek to elect government officials, support or oppose political parties, or, generally, take sides in global conflicts. So there's, hint number one, I think that this is kind of stemming from the Russia-Ukraine thing. The church does not generally take sides in global conflicts. The church, again, like the previous statement, this is where this reference is. The church is neutral in matters of politics within or between the world's many nations, lands, and peoples. However, as an institution, it reserves the right to address issues that it believes have significant moral consequences or that directly affect the mission, teachings, or operations of the church. Now I'm going to skip forward a little bit, because in the old statement, further down in the section that says what the church doesn't do and what the church does do, it said that the church reserves the right as an institution to address in a nonpartisan way issues that it believes have significant community or moral consequences or that directly affect the interests of the church. So that sentence was removed from that section and moved up to the introduction and then modified. How was it modified? Before it said that the church would get involved on issues that have significant community or moral consequences. They removed the word community. And then it said the church might also get involved on issues that directly affect the interests of the church. But now they say they'll reserve the right to get involved in things that affect not the interests of the church, but the mission, teachings, or operations of the church. So you might look at that and say, well, that they're just being a bit more specific about what interests are, because interests can be vague. So they're saying that they're going to get involved if it affects the church's mission, its teachings, doctrine, or its logistical operations. That seems to make sense. I find it interesting, though, that not only did they remove the word community, but they're talking about issues. It reserves the right to address issues. So it's almost like they're saying, we're not going to get involved in politics, but we might get involved in issues. And I get what they're trying to say. It's like the difference between policies and politics. Like policies are, these laws or these regulations, this is our policy. So there's policies on the one hand, and then there's politics, which is all the machinations and the maneuvering and the logistical whatever about enacting policy. But I don't think you can quite separate the two. I mean, this is my day job, is working in policy and politics. If you draw a Venn diagram, I don't think that they are totally separate circles, right? I think there's a ton of overlap. How much? Who knows? I'd say 75%, right? Lots of overlap. So for the church to say, we're not going to get involved in politics, we're neutral, not on party politics, because before they were just saying we're neutral on party politics, which meant that they could still engage without, undermining that statement in nonpartisan politics. And that statement I read before that they revised even said the church reserves the right to address in a nonpartisan way issues that it believes have an impact on our interests. So they were emphatic on saying we're not getting involved in partisan politics and we are working in a nonpartisan way. That seemed to be more the emphasis before, was the partisan nature of things. Now that seems to be blurred or reduced, because now they removed the neutrality about party politics. Now it's just saying we're neutral in matters of politics within or between the world's many nations. The church doesn't generally take sides in global conflicts, so that's, the number one Russia-Ukraine potential thing. But then number two, now they're focusing more internationally, right? It's not within governments, it's even between the world's many nations. It's talking about this international geopolitical conflict. Significant moral consequences. No more community issues, but things that affect the mission, teachings, or operations of the church. Okay, let's move on. The next item, comparing before and after. In the old statement on political neutrality, it said that the church does not allow its buildings, membership lists, or other resources to be used for partisan political purposes. Now, in the updated statement, they removed the word partisan. So again, this moving away from partisan and abstracting this to anything remotely political, right? So now it's just saying that the church doesn't allow these resources to be used for political purposes, which you may say, well, that seems reasonable because, local city issues are supposedly nonpartisan in a lot of cases, or there's, things happening at the legislature that may not be a partisan issue. Maybe it's a bipartisan issue, but it's still a political issue. So this might be a more holistic way for the church to look at just saying, hey, we're not going to use the resources for anything political. And then the church added in a few new things that are not present in the old statement. So this new statement is much longer than the previous one. Among them, the first one I'll share, it says that the church does not advise its members on how to vote, which I find interesting because, as I've shared before, when we were doing Prop 2 in Utah, it was the first, and to my knowledge, only time that the area presidency has sent an email to every member of the church using the church email system, basically telling them how to vote. I should have looked up the email. I could have read verbatim from it, but it was pretty clear on saying this is the church's position and we encourage you to act accordingly, right? Maybe it didn't have the specific explicit words saying all Mormons should vote this way, or every member of the church should cast their ballot in this way, but it was very, very clear. Not even like you have to read between the lines or you have to have these biases and assumptions. Like it was just extremely clear. So now I'm in real time going to see if I can find that email, because I remember, in fact, I replied to the area president. Here it is. I just found it. Official church announcement, it says. I'm looking at the email right now. This was sent August 2018. Dear brothers and sisters, in November, Proposition 2, an initiative which would legalize the sale and use of marijuana, will appear on the ballot. Its proponents, hi, that's me, assert that it will make medical marijuana available to those suffering with debilitating pain and other infirmities. However, in truth, it goes much further, creating a serious threat to health and public safety, especially for our youth and young adults, by making marijuana generally available with few controls. Total BS, but whatever. It's water under the bridge and we've moved on. The email continues. The church joins a coalition of medical experts, public officials, and community stakeholders in calling for a safe and compassionate approach to providing medical marijuana to those in need. The church does not object to the medicinal use of marijuana if doctor prescribed, which they can't prescribe a federally illegal substance, in dosage form through a licensed pharmacy. So here it is, right? And they bolded it. So I'm now reading from a section of the email that is bold. It says, as a member of the coalition, we urge voters of Utah to vote no on Proposition 2, end bold text, and join us in a call to state elected officials to promptly work with medical experts, patients, and community leaders to find a solution that will work for all Utahns without the harmful effects that will come to pass if Proposition 2 becomes law. For more information... For more information on Proposition 2, please refer to this legal analysis prepared for the church by Curtin McConkie. And it links to this legal analysis. And I'm laughing because for those of you who haven't heard me share this story before, this legal analysis was one of the worst legal analyses that I've ever encountered. And every attorney that I circulated it to thought it was written by like a law school intern. It was very poor. And myself, who's a wannabe attorney, but I'm not formally an attorney, I picked this whole thing apart and had a joy doing it and published this. I think I called it Rebuttal to the Curtin McConkie Memo shortly after it was released. And so I published this thing, send it out to the media, get a bunch of media coverage. And then Curtin McConkie comes back and publishes a response to the rebuttal to their own memo. So we had this like tit for tat thing going on, and we're sparring publicly. So for them to refer to this legal analysis prepared for the church, it was just, I've been toying with the idea, been doing a musing down the road on the relationship between Curtin McConkie and the LDS Church. So maybe we'll do that down the road. But back to the point. Here's an email that 5 years ago was sent by the church saying, and I quote, in bold text, "We urge voters of Utah to vote no on Proposition 2. Fast forward 5 years, and the revised statement on political neutrality now says that the church does not advise its members on how to vote. So maybe there's two responses here. Number one is, hey, Connor, they just said that now. They didn't hold themselves to that restriction before, so that gives them permission, if you will, to have done it in the past, but just saying, hey, moving forward, we're not going to do it. It could very well be that the church learned its lesson from what happened and said, oh, we're not doing that anymore, right? So they could have been learning from that very unique experience of emailing every member of the church in Utah with an email address on their account to urge them to vote a particular way, right? They may have gotten so much backlash, as there was a ton of backlash and faith crisis and all this kind of stuff happening at the time as a result of the church, doing what they did. So it's possible that they learned, and that's why we have this new statement, is they're saying, all right, we'll take that off the table. We're not going to tell people how to vote anymore. Right? So that's new. And then number two, you might say in response, well, they weren't advising members of the church on how to vote. Specifically, the email said, we urge voters of Utah to vote no on Proposition 2. So they never advised their members, even though they sent this out in an email to all their members. They were just saying this openly to voters of Utah as a member of this coalition, as it said in the email. As a member of the coalition, we urge voters of Utah. So they're not advising members. They're just a coalition member who publicly wants to tell Utah voters, like Libertas does, or like the Rotary Club, or like ACLU, or whoever, right? They're openly sharing their views. And I completely defend the church's right to do so. You get all these cranks on social media who are like, oh, tax the church, silence the church, they remove their IRS tax exemption, they shouldn't be able to speak out. No. Like every institution, every organization, every individual has that right to engage and share their views, including powerful and financially resourceful churches. So they have the right to do so. But I believe that it's very fair to say that in that instance, when the church was emailing all of its members, even though they shrouded in this language of, we're a coalition member and we urge all Utah voters to vote this way, that really they were advising their members, knowing that they have a lot of political influence in Utah. And if the church says jump to everybody else, the Mormons will respond and say, how high, right? Okay, so that's a new addition to the statement. The church now, apparently in the future, does not advise its members on how to vote. Now, to be fair, other than like reading some letters over the pulpit, I know when Arizona was doing its recreational marijuana thing, all throughout Arizona, there was letters over the pulpit, Nevada as well. Like from time to time, the church will send out these letters to be read over the pulpit to make clear the church's position. But I don't know that even in any of those, people are advised to vote a particular way. It's just, hey, we want you to go engage. We want you to go, so it's, I think a lot of leadership kind of knows the direction that members of the church will go if they're mobilized. So I'm not saying this is accurate by any means. It's just I have never encountered any other instance in which the church told its members to vote a particular way, other than if you go back to like the early 1800s and mid 1800s. So that's a new inclusion in the statement. Here's another one. The church does not typically issue statements regarding disputes in or between nations, lands, or peoples. Rather, it teaches the gospel of Jesus Christ with the knowledge that living these principles limits contention and hostilities. The church, so here's another like Russia-Ukraine kind of influence, I feel like. because they're probably getting asked a lot about, these situations. The church does not typically issue statements regarding disputes in and between nations. Which I find interesting because, again, the commandment to renounce war and proclaim peace, wars are between nations. These are disputes. They are disputes between nations. And so we are commanded by Scripture, I feel like, to effectively issue statements regarding disputes between nations when those disputes are war, and we're supposed to renounce war. And you might say in response, well, the Scriptures don't say to renounce particular wars. It doesn't require you to speak out against any individual war. It just says to renounce war. So maybe that's a broader thing, like renounce warfare, and maybe there's some merit there. But I don't really think you can renounce war, broadly speaking, without helping people understand specific applications of what you're trying to say. It's like, oh, let's stay in the abstract and speak theoretically and, be anti-war in general, but then be totally fine with these specific wars that are happening, right now. Doesn't make sense. So that's a new inclusion. The church does not issue statements regarding disputes in and between nations. Here's another new inclusion in the new statement. There's two of them. In the section where it says what the church does do, it says that the church does, number one, believe and teach that members should be, quote, subject to kings, presidents, rulers, and magistrates in obeying, honoring, and sustaining the law. Article of Faith, number 12. And number two, the church does recognize a universal right to the free exercise of conscience and believes all individuals and institutions should be able to express publicly their views on issues facing society. So the church does say we should be subject to all these politicians. Again, this, for those of you who have read my stuff or listened for a while, our official interpretation of Article of Faith 12, I think, is bunk. As is D&C 134, which has its own, some positives, but also some qualifiers and concerning things. If you're interested and haven't heard me talk about that, I write all about it in Christ versus Caesar, talking about how the way that we reference the 12th article of faith, I think, is wrong. Nonetheless, that was included in the new statement. Here's another interesting one. This is something that was in the past statement. That's been revised and augmented for the new statement. So previously, there's this section that said, the church expects its members to engage in the political process in an informed and civil manner, respecting the fact that members of the church come from a variety of backgrounds and experiences and may have differences of opinion in partisan political matters. Okay, so number one, the statement was modified. Before it said that the church expects its members to engage in the process and to do so civilly. They expect their members to do so. Now it says that the church encourages them to do so. That's fine. Seems like a benign change. But then they add this statement, this sentence to the end of this little paragraph. So this part's new. The church also encourages its members to keep all communications, parentheses, including on social media, respectful and aligned with Christ-like behavior. So, of course, on the coattails of General Conference and President Nelson basically talking about exactly this and having more civility on social media and in our interactions, no surprise that here in this statement where they're talking about engaging but doing so civilly, that they're saying, hey, even in your communications, including on social media, that you should be this way. Next week's musing, unless I come up with a different idea in the meantime, is going to expound more on this. Can we be civil and engage in civics? Like, is that possible? Because when you stand for truth, you're going to piss some people off and they're going to fight back. And, to say that we should, as it says here, we should be aligned with Christ-like behavior. Well, Christ at one point intentionally braided a whip to go whip people in the temple. So I don't think it's like, let's be lovey-dovey all the time. I'm going to get more into that next week, how I see a balance there between standing on principle and being a bold advocate for what you believe, even though everyone will hate you for it and fight you and so forth. What does it mean to be aligned with Christ-like behavior and to engage respectfully and civilly? So more to come probably next week on that musing. But that's a new reference as well. Here's another entirely new section. The church provides humanitarian assistance around the world, including areas of international conflict. While political strife may be a factor in causing the need for assistance, the church will generally not comment on the conflict itself. Rather, the church seeks to live the Savior's two great commandments, to love God and our neighbor, by alleviating suffering wherever it is found, regardless of the race, nationality, tribe, political persuasion, or religious affiliation of those involved. Okay, so here's another like Russia-Ukraine kind of potential influence. Like, hey, we're just going to help everybody. You can go like kill one another. We're not going to say anything bad about it. You can be fighting and declaring war and oppressing different groups and genocidally engaging in ethnic cleansing of that population and all these things. So you do you. I mean, I'm being a little bit snarky here, right? But like, you do you, and we'll just show up with, diapers and peanut butter to help. And sorry, I'm being a bit flippant, right? Like, it's important to go help people because this suffering is going to be with you, and the poor you'll always have with you, Jesus said, and blood and horror raining all over the earth as a result of Satan. So it's so awesome that the church engages as much as it does. We should be individually doing the same. Again, these are individual obligations, not institutional obligations. So it's fine that the church is, using our tithing money for that or whatever, but like we still need to be doing our part. So it's awesome that the church is engaged in providing humanitarian assistance around the world. But to say that the church will generally not comment on the conflict itself, I find curious. Right? And maybe it's the word generally here. Like this is really written well by attorneys and PR people, right? Like reviewed and nitpicked, because there's enough loopholes in here that, they can do different things. To say the church does not typically, do this. The church does not generally do this. And right, it's like the general welfare clause of the Constitution. It just becomes this like broad thing that allows all these other things in. And so to say that the church generally doesn't comment on the conflict itself still allows the church in the future to comment on a particular conflict, because they're just going to say, well, we generally don't do it, but in this particular case, we feel the need to, which is fine. But to kind of rule it out in general and just say, we're not going to talk about the conflict, I find curious. I find it concerning. Again, like, what does it mean to renounce war? What does it mean to, like, it's one thing to stand up and just say at the pulpit, love everybody all the time, right? And speak in abstractions and generalities. Maybe that's the better word, to speak in generalities. But it seems like the saints are having a hard time getting the message unless and until they are assisted in specific application of those general ideas. I mean, like, it's this way with my kids. I can sit down over dinner and have like a big high-level discussion about a particular principle, let's say fairness, and they'll nod their heads and yeah, it's important to be fair. But then like a particular situation happens, and that is the moment at which I take that general idea that I had taught and I give it specific application. Hey, just like we talked about the other day, wouldn't you agree that it's important to be fair in this particular instance? And here's what fairness would look like. Oh yeah. And then they're learning, right? And then, oh, okay. And so we're all spiritual children in that sense, naive and ignorant and causing all kinds of mistakes. And I think that we need our hands held in that sense, that these general ideas, these higher level abstractions of love and peace and all the things have more potency, I would think, when they're given specific application. And again, I think a lot of this stems from, I don't know, fear, perhaps, fear of a country getting, like Russia, getting pissed off and persecuting Mormons as they have been with the Jehovah's Witnesses, who I continue to have admiration for standing their ground and facing persecution. They've been persecuted throughout history by all kinds of despotic regimes. But here we are, I think, out of fear for impeding the progress of missionary work and keeping temples open and all the rest, not wanting to offend these powerful regimes and these dictators and these, political thugs. And so we just say, we're generally not going to comment on that. We're just going to go over here and love people. So I get it. And there's trade-offs everywhere. And I'm not going to claim to know what God has said other than what I've read in the scriptures. And so I don't know what it means to renounce war without actually commenting on conflicts. I mean, Spencer Kimball saying we're a warlike people, right? Like, when we have specific application, we learn better, and the saints are more likely to get it and apply it. But when we just, I don't know, speak in generalities, I feel like the message does not land. So people can nod their head and be like, yeah, I'm righteous. Yeah, I want peace. And then they'll go vote for all the politicians who are advocating war, and they'll support going to war. They'll respond favorably in a poll. Yeah, I want to go to war. They'll call their congressman and demand that we go retaliate against that country and all the rest. And they'll go patriotically think that everything's awesome and yay, America. And so they're not applying, right, the principle to the practice. I think that's the biggest problem of our day, is people are willing and able to believe the generalized principle, but when the rubber meets the road, they're failing to consistently apply it to particular instances. When I wrote my first book, Latter-day Liberty, I structured it so that the first half was all principle and the second half was all policies and practices, so that I could say, all right, we talked about these, principles here. Let's now see what it looks like when they're applied to specific things like the war on drugs or immigration, the Constitution, and so forth. Okay, so the church will generally not comment on the conflict itself. That's another new section and this kind of international intrigue influence. Finally, there's a conclusion statement. Just like there's an augmented introduction, now there is a conclusion statement which reads, to navigate the application of these principles of political neutrality and participation in an ever-changing and complex world, the First Presidency of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints will continue to seek prophetic wisdom and revelation on these matters. So that's new, which is fine to say, hey, we're going to be open to new guidance and direction, but I found that interesting. So I feel like this statement's revisions overall is probably as a result of the ongoing Russia-Ukraine thing. I feel like there's echoes back to what I mused about a year and a half ago, back when they released that statement about peace. Who knows? I mean, even they've ingratiated themselves with the UN over the years. At the beginning of this year, I did a musing called New Year, New World Order, and talked about the church's connections to the United Nations and other globalist entities. And so it could be that they're getting pressure or being lobbied by these globalist enterprises and so forth. And so maybe they're just saying, hey, that's not our business. We're going to bow out. So like strategically, I get it. If I'm running a whole organization, I'm probably going to say I don't want to get mired in that conflict. I don't want to get blowback from speaking out against that thing. I mean, look at what happens when people speak out against and go against the current, right? They're canceled, they're attacked, they're shut down. And so, leaders of the church are probably seeing themselves as stewards of this program that they need to move forward and not have it go on ice in any particular country that they offend or upset. And so they're probably weighing the calculus and saying, oh, better that we just stay in our lane, focus on loving people and providing humanitarian assistance, but not comment on all the machinations of the world. At the end of the day, I have always believed that, as I said a moment ago, these are all individual obligations that we have and not ultimately institutional ones. So sometimes, yes, I wish the church would say something differently or do something differently, and I've been very open about that, in part because they have a lot of influence. It's a big bully pulpit, like when they email all these Utah members of the church to vote against Prop 2 and our polling numbers drastically shift. So they carry a lot of influence. And to that end, I wish sometimes that, things would be said or done differently. But the other reason why I talk about what the church is or isn't doing in particular cases is that we members of the church have become such sleepy sheep that we are unlikely to act in ways that the church itself is not acting. We're waiting for direction from the institution, right? We're deferring to the institution to direct and guide our affairs. And so if the church isn't doing it, then most members of the church will interpret that as, oh, it must not be important, right? If it was important, they would speak out about it. And because they're not, then it's not. So I can just go focus on whatever I want to focus on and not change my behavior or who I support politically or the policies that I'm promoting because the church isn't saying it. Well, the church may not be saying it for completely different reasons. And yet our culture is such that if the church is not communicating it, then people perceive it to not be important or anything that they need to engage in, which I think is totally fallacious. And yet that is the culture that we've inherited and belong to. So, I mean, the statement, I don't know, mixed bag, interesting, some curious things, moving away from the whole partisan nature of things, talking more broadly about disengaging in politics, having these loophole words. Generally, we don't do this. Typically, we don't do this. Generally, we don't do that. Allowing themselves to still do things when they feel it necessary. Trying to separate politics from issues, saying we don't engage in politics, but we will engage in certain issues that, connect to us at all. I don't know, kind of interesting. So super duper political neutrality, augmented from the previous version. And we will see moving forward how this goes and what this looks like and how it manifests. I'm curious more than anything. It was a year and a half ago or whatever, doing the musing about all the ways that I've seen the church get involved politically in Utah, right? I'm curious to see what that looks like moving forward here in Utah, but in Congress, I have many friends at the federal level who have particular insights into the church's involvement there. So I'm going to kind of wait and watch and see if this changes anything or if it's just, words on a page that won't change much in practice. So find it curious. Hopefully that was informative for you. A little bit of a before and after comparison. Again, I hadn't seen anyone do that online at all and kind of highlight the differences. Obviously it might be, like 90% faster for you to have just read a quick side by side, but thought I would muse on it, offer some commentary and some context behind it. And unless things go differently, next week we'll talk more about civility and civics and how we can be engaged and piss people off while still being respectful and standing for truth. So I'm going to be giving that some thought and reflection throughout the week. Going to be on Young Men's Camp all week in Moab with my boy and a whole bunch of other boys. So should be fun. But I'll be reflecting on this in preparation for next week, and we'll see you then. SundayMusings.org if you've missed any of the last ones. Be sure to rate and review the podcast on your favorite podcast app. That helps spread it around. Appreciate you guys, and we'll see you next week.